right. All right, everybody. This is Shane Passiello with the Passiello Group. Me and Jean. Jean, you can say hi.
Hi, I'm Jean Spellman with Passiello Group.
We're going to be closing out the final 2 hours. We're going to be closing out the final 2 hours here of ID 24. And with us, up next, we have Marc Cajolet from Kronos. It's kind of great that Marc's doing this. I was with him a few years ago when Kronos started a journey, and it's great to see that they've kind of reached the end. And I think Marc will be covering that a little bit in his talk that he's about to do for us. So without delay, I'll introduce Marc Cajolet. I believe your title is you're the Senior Manager in User Research Technology over at Kronos.
That's right.
But, we'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Gene. Thanks, Gene. So thank you. It's great to have an opportunity to talk about the work of accessibility that I've had the opportunity to do at Kronos, and as a result of that, really I don't think of this as the end of a journey. It's a continuing journey. The best part of this was that really working toward a product release gave us a goal and gave us something to focus on, but it also gave us the opportunity to really sort of internalize a lot of process things that were necessary to incorporate this and make it a standard practice in the organization, which was really the goal. So working with TPG helped us to get to that point where we've been able to become much more self-sufficient in terms of designing and building and testing for accessibility. So that's the purpose of my talk today is to talk about in particular the user experience and how usability benefits from the work of accessibility. I found that the two things related to each other are actually really a tremendous combination that motivates our designers and development team. So let me jump into the slides and make sure that you can see what I am sharing here. So title of the talk is Accessibility Gives Usability a Boost, and I'll get to some examples. I wanted to do a couple things first. As Shane mentioned, gave me sort of a quick introduction there, and I am really primarily a user experience professional who's come to accessibility recently, working in web and desktop and mobile applications. I've had to take on the role of evangelist and product owner and project manager for accessibility within the company, which has really been an exciting journey, as Shane mentioned. My contact information is there. If you don't know Kronos, we are a global software company focused on workforce management that's used by many large organizations, and of those in healthcare and retail, service and delivery, manufacturing, and public sector. The public sector is probably where we were most driven to focus on accessibility because of the requirements in that market. But we've been able to take that and generalize it to all of our markets. So that's really sort of what led me into accessibility, and I'd like to share with you some of the things that I've discovered as it relates directly to user experience. So a quick outline of the talk. I'll go through for those of you who haven't listened to the last 22 hours of talks, a brief terminology definition. I'm sure you can find many more throughout ID 24. Some demonstrations which I'll, for the most part, will link over to rather than doing interactively. I'll talk about why accessibility is so important now in terms of the enterprise software market and in particular for our company, and how it helps our users, and in fact how it's helped our overall usability strategy. I'll go through this strategy at a high level and talk about some of the guiding principles and the role of the user experience team for accessibility. And what would a user experience discussion be without talking a little bit about persona. So I'll talk about how that has helped us enlighten the teams. And then also share with you some process and artifacts for building accessibility that have been produced along the way, which were all these things were pieces that I really searched for as we started in on this journey. I will mention a few references to the other ID24 talks. It's really a great collaboration that I've seen over the 24 hours. So briefly, and I do mean briefly because I think you can get much more of this on the web through ID24. But when we talk about disabilities, we're talking about vision, hearing, mobility, cognitive type of disabilities. When we talk about accessibility, we're talking about access to, in this case, I'm focused on software systems for people with disabilities, leveraging assistive technology, screen readers, magnifiers, different ways of extending the keyboard input or the manual input, if you will, into the computer through alternative pointing devices and speech input. Section 508 certainly it was a term that was kicked around a lot in the requirements and in our sales cycle. It meant different things to different people, but when it came right down to it, it was one of the driving forces behind setting up more specific requirements for accessibility so that our customers comply with Section 508, and they do that through a solution that provides accessibility. Along that journey, one of the critical tools that we needed to provide for our customers was a voluntary product assessment using a standard template, otherwise known as a VPAT. This is a very useful sales tool as well as documentation to various procurement offices for really understanding the level of accessibility to expect in a vendor solution. And finally, WCAG, which again, if you haven't heard by now, the Web Consortium Accessibility Guidelines are a fantastic resource that really is the basis for many of the things that go into building and testing for accessibility. So like I said, won't really dwell on these, but just to put it in plain terms, web accessibility, it means that people can, with disabilities, can use the web applications. They can perceive them, understand them, navigate, interact them the way all of us expect to, without hindrance. And although the accessibility standards, when you read through the web standards, they can be a little overwhelming. I've found a schema and a topology, which I'll share a little bit with you later on. We have chosen to really focus on what I think many of the industry vendors are focusing on, which is, say, level AA. Level AA giving us sort of the best results in a most affordable way and most achievable way. So everything that we're doing is really focused around building for WCAG 2.0 level AA. So with that very brief introduction, let me go on to talk more about why accessibility is so important to us and why it's so important to users of applications. First of all, it really is increasing in priority. We're seeing this as a business driver with a pervasive digital economy that is out there everywhere in the world today. More and more things are done through your computer, through the internet, through cloud solutions. And so planning for and building for accessibility is critical to make those resources available to everyone. So there are certainly, if you've listened to some of the other talks and look at some of the news going on, there are international shifts in the public sector that are really moving to and continuing to raise the bar for accessibility. Some of those are explicit legal drivers. I mentioned the U.S. Section 508, the refresh that's going on, the expectation that more and more organizations, especially those that receive public funding, will be required to adhere to. For big companies, it's things like big lawsuits, and those cause big actions. When it comes right down to it, that can be a very strong motivator. So these drivers, along with really just doing the right thing, providing universal access, have all been, when tied together. When I think about this as a strategist within the company, talking to the right stakeholders in a company about what's driving us toward a solution and being able to articulate the need there is an important part of getting your accessibility strategy off the ground if you are still working on that within your own company. So I do recommend the What's Law Got to Do with It for a deeper look at the legal aspects of accessibility. So moving more toward the user-centric approach, understanding the user is sort of a tenet of any user experience design. I found the web was full of a tremendous amount of resources, but what I was really searching for were some really compelling stories, first-person stories, and I found several, but the two that really I found resonated. One is the Tommy Edison video. If you haven't discovered Tommy Edison, he calls himself the blind film critic. I saw him speak a year ago at Access U in Austin, Texas, and just a really great, funny guy, radio personality, and has some really compelling stories. But what he is able to do in a short bursts, 2 or 3 minute YouTube channel videos, is to explain to everyday sighted people what it's like to be blind, to use a computer, to use an ATM, to use various devices in the world. And what I found was that was a great starting point to help bring other people around me into human terms with why accessibility is important, and how to sort of start thinking about that in a practical term. And then Chris Hill's videos are also really inspiring. So I won't play through these here. If you're watching this in replay, I'd suggest you pause here and link out to those YouTube channels and watch a few, but make sure you come back. And I think you'll see that it really it gives you an interesting perspective about how interactions are different, but certainly just as powerful from what we might think of as traditional means from an able-bodied person. So how does it help? How does accessibility help someone gain access to and complete anything that they need to do, whether it's workforce management or purchasing something online? So these go back to the sort of fundamental different types of impacts for a visual, low vision, or blindness disability. The impact is plainly, if you can't see or have trouble seeing the UI, it's going to be difficult to use unless there's a solution that provides enhanced contrast for low vision, or scaling, or magnification to make things on screen large enough, or to just read the screen, to make what is visual audible. And so what I've found in talking with many of the designers and developers is that understanding sort of the different aspects of these abilities is an important part. It isn't just one thing, and it's typically not one thing in isolation, but it can be a combination and different degrees of any of these. So when it comes to motor control, having a limited range of motion or coordination, being able to have the fine motor control that's necessary to use a mouse or a pointing device can be difficult or impossible. So taking that into consideration, a solution that provides things like keyboard shortcuts and alternative navigation options. Quite often the keyboard shortcut to to allow access through a more discrete motion can be tremendously enabling. It also allows access to assistive technology devices for alternative input. So, for example, in Chris Hill's case, he's using a switch control, which is really fascinating to think that being able to navigate a keyboard and screen using a simple switch is an amazing achievement of technology and human will. So, also considering cognitive disabilities where processing speed, the impact there being that it requires more time to process and understand. We may be less tolerant of distractions on the screen. So solutions there involve putting more control in the user's hand and just fundamentally avoiding things like timeouts and simplifying in every way. When it comes right down to it, everyone benefits from this. Personally, as far as auditory disabilities are concerned, I have not had a lot of experience with this. Personally, the content that I'm building in the enterprise web application space does not rely heavily on audio in our case, but certainly difficulty or inability to hear requires that things like audio content for video or any kind of education material or even just cues coming from the interface need to have redundant ways of presenting those. In the obvious case, it would be closed captioning. So as I mentioned, sort of thinking about these different types of and combinations of and degrees of is an important exercise. And again, understanding the human element of this, seeing it firsthand. Look at some of the videos I mentioned there. I'll refer to some of the persona later that also help in communicating these into requirements in the planning phase of software development. So this is just a kind of a switch over to look at some of the basic things that can be configured right out of the box using in this case, the example of the Windows high contrast theme. By just turning this on, it goes and begins to address low vision or difficulty, maybe color blindness that can be overcome by just adjusting the screen contrast to a higher level. These are tools that are built into the operating system. In my experience, I have not really had to do anything special in terms of software design or development to accommodate this, other than to pay attention to some of the rules of general rules of color design, which I'll also mention a little further on here. I did mention that we have a demonstration, and again, rather than doing that live here, I would encourage you to pause if you're watching replay or check this later. This is the result of the first effort around delivering an accessible workforce management solution, which we did using the iPad and VoiceOver, providing the screen reader capability, and also designing for and accommodating zoom and touch capabilities, the inversion of colors, and so forth. So we're pretty happy with the results. We've had customers who have also engaged with us and responded to that, and are able to now access the capabilities that they were not previously. So I'm going to talk about how we got there and not as much about what it was that we did. And again, I encourage you to check out the video that is linked here. So on to the strategy. The strategy really is a path with a goal to follow. We really focused on end-to-end use cases, and I think that was part of the realization that we couldn't just look at where we had failed before on one screen or one particular aspect as something we needed to go back and fix or retest. What we needed to focus on was ensuring that it was working end-to-end. That really that a user could log on and complete a workflow, and that was the most important aspect. So using that as a guiding principle, and building stories around end-to-end use cases, using narratives when we go through demonstrations is an excellent way to ensure accessibility is working throughout. We also took the next step to add accessibility to our specifications and designs, and I'll show you some examples toward the end of this. Things like wireframes and visual designs can include some of these specifications so that it's not entirely up to the developer who doesn't put the burden entirely on their shoulders to sort of figure it out based on a bunch of guidelines, but can rather provide some specific designs around accessibility. I also recommend leveraging automation. Testing automation can really cut down on the amount of time it takes to go through some of the repetitive tasks for all testing, and accessibility is similar in that way. But it's not a substitute for manual testing and testing with experts. So a key part of our strategy was to work with people who use assistive technology in the first person, that they are subject matter experts and can really report and experience some of these end use cases, as I mentioned, in the way a typical user would, not in the way a sort of structured test plan would, but more as a user would. And so that's really key, especially as you get toward completing the system. I recommend auditing at each release milestone. It kind of gives you a big picture of where are we, how are we doing. We've been doing this now for about 2 years, and those audits are important to kind of step back and get an overall sense of the progress and areas for improvement. And as I mentioned, having a partnership with users, ideally a customer advisory board, which we are now working with advisors in our customer base who have this as a priority, have this as a requirement, and can give us feedback. One other talk here that I would recommend on ID24 was Close Encounters of an Inclusive Design. I watched this earlier today, and I think you'll see some common themes here around strategy and experience. So guiding principles for accessibility. These come right out of the WCAG accessibility principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, robust. When you stop and look at these words, it just makes sense, but you do need to kind of stop and look at them. So I'm going to break each of these down a little bit and give you some examples where, as I mentioned, a lot of the focus here has been around accessibility and the accessibility guidelines, but in fact there's a strong overlap here with usability. And the thesis of this presentation is that overlap is something that, especially from a user experience and user interface design, can become a strong factor in both thinking about and being successful with accessibility, because it's improving the usability, and usability is typically improving accessibility. So they go hand in hand. So perceivable is, as described here, being able to perceive in a way that if one sense does not permit that perception, then we have another way of sensing that. So simply providing text alternatives for non-text content. So if you can't see the picture, then describe the picture. Providing captions in multimedia. Providing content that can be presented in a different way that the assistive technology can pick up on without losing meaning. And that's where it starts to get tricky, and I'll go into that a little bit more. It probably falls more under understandable. But structure, things like hierarchies, visual hierarchies, and visual systems are a big part of meaning, communicating meaning, and so making sure that is not lost in the translation to alternative ways of perceiving. But ideally, we're trying to make it easier for everyone. So let me give you a couple of examples here. So I'm going to switch to some screenshots here of this enterprise software system I talked about. This is a rather complex screen that does some scheduling for employees. There's lots of detail here that have to do with toolbars and calendar ranges and employees. But one of the things that we identified in the analysis, this is a previous version of the product, was that it fundamentally failed some of the color contrast testing. That these, the intentions around the subtleties of color, primarily for aesthetic reasons and not sort of overpowering the interface, did not pass the color contrast tests for accessibility. Nor did the various icons for recognition or touch target size. So with those problems, and this is kind of the overlap, the intersection with usability, these things are a problem if you have any kind of color challenges or low vision or any kind of fine motor control in terms of touch target. But the reality is that this screen could be improved, and the usability improvements around revising the color scheme, providing attention to the readability of this overall, and improving touch targets were all a result of having done an accessible design review and then redesigning it and improving it to pay attention to all of these things. So higher contrast around the color, greater text size around the labels, and also improved touch targets for, we're thinking now more about touch interface, but this helps with even the mouse so that the targets are not so fine. So this is one example, a combination really of perceivable as well as some side benefits to usability. In the category of operable, making functionality available, from the keyboard, giving users enough time to read and use the content, helping users to navigate and find content. Again, operability. This is a fundamental premise of accessibility, but also of usability. So, for example, again, a screenshot from an earlier version where there were usability issues that were identified with, this is an iPad now, the ability to sort of tap inside of this grid, a time card that represents time collected for a particular person over the course of a week, to tap and hold to allow the punch to be edited or a pay code to be edited. It was difficult to discover. It was difficult to reproduce. There are a lot of things like this in iOS that are sort of, someone has to show you that it's unlikely that you'll find them. But to put that in as a core piece of the interface really ended up causing some usability issues. It was also compounded by VoiceOver, where a single tap and hold becomes double tap and hold, and that was nearly impossible to do. So we were able to simplify the gesture to make it a tap instead of tap and hold. Seems simple, but it took some time and thought about how to handle all the use cases around that. Of course, there's never just one thing that changes. There's often related changes that have to be made. So, and making the menu modal so that once that little menu pops up, it becomes operable, especially to a screen reader, VoiceOver user, and you're not going off onto other parts of this complex interface, but it's simply choosing from the menu. So under understandable, the guideline there, making text readable and understandable, making content appear and operate in predictable ways, Again, seems like common sense from a user experience standpoint. Try and help the user to avoid making mistakes and allow them to easily correct them. Here's an example from a panel which we spent quite a bit of time on. You've probably seen things like this in various degrees, but when you're refining a grid, for example, sorting, filtering, grouping, there are often some fairly sophisticated ways of doing that. This panel here was a combination of tabs and lists, and really to think about as we sat down and began to lay out the HTML to build this. This is part of a web interface now. There was quite a confusing hierarchy, and that provided some real challenges for the keyboard user. It was also difficult to think about the structure of this for a screen reader. So in breaking this down and talking about this from an accessibility standpoint, what we found was that in improving the structure of the tabs, bringing more attention to the headings, to the list structure, it simplified keyboard access. It provided what you might perceive as a hierarchy to a sighted user. It provided a hierarchy to the screen reader and to a user who would be perceiving this solely through audio output. And again, what would appear to be a fairly straightforward task could become quite complex when these controls got sort of muddled together. And the end result is that by thinking about this in an accessible way, I think we've improved the usability of this this panel, which is used. It can be used at a high frequency to rearrange and sort data. This is just the sort of second page here when the filtering is put into effect. So I guess you get a better appreciation for just how many different ways sorting and grouping could be turned on, and some of the challenges you might face in selecting those from lists and understanding which filter is in effect and clearing those and so forth. So those presented a number of challenges just in terms of implementation, as I mentioned, and going back and thinking about that in an accessible way, but really improved overall usability. So those are a few examples. I want to sort of flip to a little higher level of discussion around WCAG. I mentioned earlier that when you look at WCAG, especially if you're doing it for the first time or getting into this and trying to understand how am I going to make sense out of this, how am I going to ever be able to build and design in an accessible way, there's an awful lot of rules to follow. This is an excellent resource that is part of WCAG, this at-a-glance view that kind of separates the things I just talked about in terms of the guiding principles for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, and then the categories of guidelines in their notation, and then the different levels. So using this topology and having spent some time kind of trying to map this, what I found is we can make some generalizations. So first of all, and now I'm personalizing this to the problems that we faced. I wasn't particularly dealing with a lot of time-based media, so didn't spend as much time looking at that. These were not areas that were sort of likely to be a problem in the nature of our web content, which is largely sort of transactional forms and editors. What I'm suggesting is that the area of understandable and robust, while very well described in the WCAG guidelines, in the end are really just good user experience. So I don't mean to trivialize that in any way. What I mean is that if you are practicing and testing for and refining and building a good user experience around that is intended to be, quote, easy to use, that you are probably addressing many of the guidelines in the area of understandability, readability, predictability, and so forth. And the same for robustness in terms of extension and compatibility with different versions. So the good news there is that from a testing standpoint, the guidelines in WCAG for things like predictability, for example, provide you some discrete ways of measuring usability, which, as a user experience professional, one of the things I've always found is that it's difficult because it's such a kind of a gray, squishy area. How do you test usability? How do you measure that in anything but a subjective fashion? Actually, WCAG really helps us out here. So I am kind of bucketing this, that the two can go hand in hand, that if you're doing good user experience design, you're well on your way to providing something that's understandable and robust. And the flip side of that is that if you're challenged by user experience design, and you can look to WCAG to help both guide and test and identify areas for improvement around understandability, that those are powerful tools. Similarly, around perception or perceivability, good visual design. Again, not trivializing. This is a significant effort and constantly requires juggling many different variables. But things like text alternatives, distinguishability, things like the contrast ratios, all of those in the end, what we've been able to incorporate into our design practice is to really focus on the visual design phase of user experience design. So by standardizing on things like style guide and building CSS that replicates that style guide, and then using drawing from the style guide, gives us a much greater degree of success when we do put an interface together, because we're drawing from some known contrast levels and known font sizes that are known to pass, and therefore giving us a big leg up on new interfaces that are built from good guidelines. When it comes from operability, the notion that structure, and here this is really more about the structure of both the layout, while that may be visual, it's also hierarchical. It's also part of the HTML semantic, that many of the things regarding keyboard accessibility and navigation are a result of building good semantic structure. And so this is, again, where having front-end development experts and investing time in really understanding the capabilities of, and in most of our development now in HTML5, that if you get the structure right, a lot of things follow from there. So I am kind of generalizing here, trying to simplify, trying to make this maybe a little less intimidating when you look at the WCAG guidelines, because if you have experts within your company, within your partnerships for user experience, good user experience, for good visual design, for good coding structure, you are set up for success in terms of being able to build an accessible solution. So with all of that, then, what is the role of user experience and accessibility? Well, what I found is that starting right at the beginning with wireframes, with annotation in the wireframes that help to highlight some of those things I just mentioned about structure, your headings, your landmarks, the things that fundamentally are lists, because by organizing those things into that sort of structure and providing a meaningful order to that at the conceptual level, at a wireframe level, everything follows from there. So then the discussion with the front-end developer is typically much more straightforward about, well, where does this belong in terms of the HTML markup. Content order, which is going to translate pretty directly into things like tab order and focus order as you move through a document, can be annotated through the wireframes. I'm going to show you a few examples here just to kind of give you an idea to what degree this needs to be done. I mentioned also with the role of visual design, including accessibility in the style guide. So things like color contrast, color and meaning. Where we're using color for meaning, making sure that we're also providing a secondary means to communicate that meaning. So that might be through a pattern, or that might be through identifying the markup to provide alternate text there. And also providing a visible focus states. I can't stress enough how anytime I look at some early development software, and one of the things that's immediately absent is this notion of focus. You don't know where you are. You don't know what happens when you press the tab key, and that can be a very good indication that first of all, you haven't really been intentional about that, and second of all, you're going to have some trouble in terms of being accessible without that. So add these things to your style guide, add these things to your wireframes, and of course validate those through user testing and understand how different disabilities might affect usage, because that's really where you're going to get the best feedback. I mentioned at the beginning having Persona for accessibility. We use Persona for many aspects of our software design, and so I found the book A Web for Everyone by Sarah and Whitney to be just a fantastic resource. Great shout out to these guys for putting together a wonderful book, not only with great design principles, but also with some really colorful and great examples of persona with different disabilities. I highly recommend the book. You can find an excerpt of this in UX Magazine with some of the screenshots of the personas. But get the book, read it, and practice it. The persona are a great way of communicating the different needs of different users, and therefore, as you work with development teams, with testing teams, it becomes much more humanized in terms of approaching the way the software is intended to work. So take a look at that, A Web for Everyone. So as we approach the end here, I do want to give you some examples. These are kind of takeaways. There's an awful lot that goes into to building for accessibility. There's a process, and that process produces artifacts which ultimately produce an accessible user experience. I can't share all of those with you, but I can at least give you some ideas about how we have created these and created a process to follow. This is a bit of an eye chart here, so maybe you want to screenshot or pause here and take a look at it. But just to navigate this, think about this as a 12-step process, or in this case, an 11-step process. If it has an asterisk, then the person in this column, the user experience person, is the lead in this effort. Otherwise, there are other stakeholders like the product owner or the accessibility expert, the UI lead or QA person that's involved. So as you can see here in brief, starting with wireframes, the primary kind of leader there, the user experience designer, is working in collaboration with the product owner to verify that we're meeting the requirements, talking with the accessibility expert that we're thinking the right way about structure and layout and the things I was just mentioning, and also collaborating with the UI lead to understand that this is something that's buildable, preferably with out-of-the-box components. And if that's iOS, it's using the standard iOS capabilities. If that's HTML, it's using as much native HTML as possible. When we get to the high fidelity stage, there again, user experience and visual designers are typically the lead on that, and continue that same sort of conversation. We've documented all these things. We typically put the deliverables, the documents, in a wiki, internal wiki, and that wiki, in addition to the documents that describe how it works and how it looks, includes a page structure, which I'm going to show you an example of in a moment. That page structure is essentially a pseudocode structure for the layout of the page. So these are sort of the first three steps that come from the user experience team. And at that point, really the responsibility and leadership moves to the product owner, working with the Scrum team to identify the stories and groom those accordingly, making sure they're in the backlog, working with the UI lead to make sure that they're reviewed for accessibility, and going back and updating any of the Confluence pages should there be changes in terms of implementation, and then working with the UI lead and the accessibility lead to accommodate any special considerations. This is, I won't underestimate this. This is where it can be really tricky. If there are new patterns that are not already previously used, if there's customization, this can get expensive and time-consuming. In the end, it may be creating a really great user experience, but keep in mind that this is one of the areas where creating accessibility, using standards and reusing components, previously solved problems is always going to be easier. So from here, stories get prioritized. They get into the backlog. As you might expect in the Scrum process, UI stories are implemented and tested. This is probably more at a unit level, at a story level. We have created a done criteria where, at a higher level,
Hey, Marc?
Yes.
Oh, just want to interrupt you for just a second, just have you kind of wrap up, because we do have a few questions that we want to get to you before your time runs out.
Excellent. Thank you, Sean.
So I'll let you wrap up, and then I have a question or two for you.
Okay. So, and in that spirit, a couple of the things here, which I'll page through so that they are in our recording. An example of a wireframe. Some of the pseudocode that I mentioned, which just sort of lays out the structure of the page. This is a descriptive language that ends up looking a lot like the HTML structure, describing what is this thing, what does it do, and what does it state. And then some example user stories. So there are some questions. Let's take those.
Yeah, so maybe just want to drop down your presentation able to space, and I can ask you a question, but a good friend of mine, Claudia Case, she asked, Marc, how does requesting VPATs make sense when Section 508 criteria is so dated?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. How does it make sense to us as an organization?
Yeah, I'm guessing, something like that. Since Section 508 criteria seems to be a little bit behind.
Yeah.
Why do you guys still request VPATs, and how does that make sense to you as a company?
Yeah. Okay. So when I mentioned that, in fact, we're typically not requesting the VPAT. It's being requested of us. So I think this is, maybe it is a sign of not fully understanding the current standards, but certainly we still encounter customers who are looking for that information. So I guess by providing it, we're attempting to satisfy a need, typically in a sales cycle, which is to report out and provide an assessment of the accessibility of our current product. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does.
Yeah.
And Mark, I was quickly interested in what you do differently from testing people in the UX lab and bringing in people for accessibility testing, people with disabilities for accessibility testing. Any pointers that you can give our listeners?
Right. What we do differently. I guess in some ways, the goal is to really not do it differently, but just to do more of it. So, for example, if we're testing a mobile application on a portable device, I've always found that it's better to test in person than, say, for example, through a web interface. So being able to sit next to a person who's holding a device or someone who's using assistive technology in the first person is just a better way of understanding the immediate needs. So what we do differently is we try to do more in-person testing. I guess that's maybe a more direct way of answering your question.
Great, thank you very much.
Well, I think that wraps up all the time we have. So thank you, Marc, for coming on and doing this presentation. On the final 2 hours we got left, we'll be back in about 10 minutes or so with our final presentation.
Great.
Which is John Metz making sure your PDF UA PDF is actually PDF UA.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.